I wanted to just speak about the topic of slavery for this week's conversation. And, we talk about good and bad owners. And I think that it's just a matter, they were all bad, especially by our standards, but they were bad even back then. Um, but it's a continuum of how bad they actually were. Um, you could have uh, benevolent owners, and even then, these people still were not free. They still were working for no money, and they still were enslaved. On the horrible end, they were abusive. They were, vicious, and they did unspeakable things to the people that they were supposed to be um, relying on for their livelihood. So, there is no quote unquote good slave owner, but I think it's a matter of varying degrees of bad. That's just my opinion. But I did want to make a couple of statements about um, this the topic because it's an important one for sure. And what is interesting, and I will write more about this, but um, what is interesting is that I read several years ago that this nation would be, and I don't know exactly how these researchers, how they quantified the amount of labor that these enslaved Africans and then later on African Americans did, um, not by choice, this forced labor. But I don't know exactly how they quantified it. But they said that this country would be 200 years behind where we are now had it not been for the millions of enslaved people who who worked here by force. Um, and there are statistics that we need to talk about, but I'll get started with the slides and then we'll go back to that. Okay, so this is the 1619 project, and it was started in 2019 with the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first um, cargo ship uh, that transported 20, 20 and odd is 20 and odd is the way it was termed by John Rolfe in a letter to um, a man named Sir Sandys, who was an investor in the Virginia Company of London. And so he was John Rolfe, the man who brought the tobacco seeds to the Virginia colony and started. He's known as the father of the tobacco industry, um, because at the time the Spaniards had a monopoly on tobacco seeds, so they wanted to be the only ones who could grow tobacco. And so and nobody really knows how John Rolfe came up with these tobacco seeds. They're very, very small. They're almost too small to see. And so he brought these tobacco seeds, and like I say, nobody knows exactly how he came to have them. But the Spaniards had a monopoly on it. So he was able to gain access to these tobacco seeds. He brought them in about 1611, 1612. And so by the time these Africans arrived in 1619, the Virginian colonists were planting tobacco, and it's thought that these 20 and odd um, Africans were put in the tobacco fields, and that would basically be the beginning of the institution of slavery as it was in the United States. But this 1619 project was a project of the New York Times, and what it sought to do, and still does, it's still an ongoing project. It sought to contextualize or put into perspective the situation that enslaved Africans and African Americans were in the United States for all those 250, 300 years. And so it's a very valuable project, and I will make sure the link is posted. I think you can see parts of it, but you may have to have a New York Times a subscription also. I'm not sure. I need to check that. So, but that they came to Jamestown. They were offloaded at Point Comfort, which was a port in the Virginia colony near the capital of Jamestown. Now, what we think of as a port and what that actually the port was are two different things. It would have been very, obviously, very remote. So I'll post a link to that, but we do need to talk about we do need to talk about the origins of slavery in this country. So the Portuguese started in basically 1456, and this Mandingo king, Nome Mansa, and this captain, Diogo Gomez, who was the Portuguese guy, they had a trading relationship. And so the Mandingo king thought that they were going to have a peaceful relationship with regulations, and instead the Portuguese guy, he seizes 650 people onto 3 ships and takes them back to Portugal. Now, what were they doing in Portugal? So there were slave traders. There was no need to kidnap them, but they took the most able-bodied West African and Central African young men to the colonies off the coast in the Azores and the Canary Islands, and they were planting sugar. The Portuguese were planting sugar there. But the difference is, and there again, there were no good slave owners, but I think they fed them. I read a book about this, about the Portuguese slave trade, and they tended to feed them better, not because they were, philanthropists or anything, not because they cared about the well-being of these people. They cared about the fact whether or not they could do the work, and so they knew that they had to feed them. And so the enslaved people in the Canaries and the Azores, they got steak, and they were relatively well fed, much better fed than they were in the British colonies anyway. So the slave trade was not it was not new. The Europeans and the Africans had been trading and had enslaved each other's people for centuries by the time this slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, ever got started. What they did was it was not based on race. It was based on whether or not you were a prisoner of war, whether or not you were captured and sold or used to pay a debt. And so it was not based on race. It was based on, for the Europeans, it was based on whether or not you were a Christian or not. So it was Christian versus non-Christian, Christian versus quote unquote savage. And that's how it started out here. So it became a system of commodities. These people became commodities. And the Portuguese are the ones that came up with this plantation system. They had plantations. They had cane plantations in the Azores and the Canaries off their coast. So before 1450, this is a map of Portugal, and then here are the Azores out here, Madeira out here, and so you had the Canaries, and this is where all of their plantations were. Canaries are down here. I didn't move my mouse. So in 1434, Gil Eanes sails south on this small wooden ship. And their issue was this. You had Prince Henry the Navigator, who was one of the younger sons of King John of Portugal. Well, based on the laws of primogeniture, the only son that was allowed to inherit anything was the oldest son. So all of your younger sons, really, they had nothing to do. So many of the adventurers, conquistadors, explorers were the younger sons of well-to-do, wealthy men who didn't have anything to inherit. They didn't have anything to do. They had enough money, but they didn't need a job, but they were at somebody else's mercy, the older brother. So Prince Henry the Navigator was one of those younger sons. Now, he had a penchant for navigation, everything nautical, map making, as in cartography, the science behind sailing. And the problem they had was that the ships that they previously were sailing, you could sail down the western coast of Africa and you could go into the Indian Ocean around the Cape of Good Hope and such, but you couldn't get back. So if you sailed down south along the coast of Africa, you're going to have to walk back to get back to the north, because the currents in the Atlantic were such that you could not sail north. So with the ships that they had at the time. So Prince Henry the Navigator and his scientists and cartographers and such, they all got together and they came up with the caravel. Well, this caravel had multiple sails and multiple ways to move these sails. So you could twist the sails so that you could manipulate the wind to your benefit. The ships also were smaller, they were shorter, and they sat higher in the water. So that meant that they could sail faster, better, easier, and they could manipulate that wind so that now, once they sail down the coast, they could also sail north rather than walking back across the Sahara Desert, which was just not going to even be a thing. So that huge innovation made a big difference in the capability of going to get to trade for African slaves. Now on these, and I told you earlier, they were growing sugar in the Azores and the Canaries. They also were growing grapes and honey, and then these plants for dye. So those were three things that I did not mention, but it was a lot of this cane. So each of these, over time, each of these countries in the European countries, the Dutch, the Spaniards, the Portuguese, the Brits, the French, they all set up what they call factories. And basically they were like the outdoor prison at Andersonville. They had palisades, and the enslaved people that were going to be making the Middle Passage, what would be called the Middle Passage, they were held in these factories, and they had horrible sanitation and they were sleeping outside unsheltered. So many of them died in the factories before they ever left Africa. But once they got they up and down the coast, every European country that was involved in this slave trade, they marked their territory and they built their factory. And so everybody knew that the Dutch were here and the French were farther south and the English were farther south. And so they all marked off their spot, and that was where their factory was. So many of the captives never left Africa. Additionally, many of the captives, they had to row them out in small boats to the ships because the ship couldn't dock or whatever right on land. So they had to sit out in the bays And so they would have to ferry these guys out, the captives out on small rowboat type vessels. Well, many times the captives would jump overboard and they were more willing to be eaten by sharks in the water or to drown than to get on a ship bound for they didn't know what. They knew it couldn't be good. And so you had lots of them that they either died in the factories or of, exposure, disease because of terrible sanitation. They had, small ditches instead of bathrooms. And so you had all sorts of germs, around in this small confined area. And then you had some that drowned or they would jump overboard to be eaten by sharks. So you have this plantation system that develops in Virginia because the tobacco, and this is not till, like 1607, 1612-ish. But tobacco requires a great deal of land to grow, and it saps all of the nutrients out of the land, out of the soil in just a few years. And so the land is then no good for planting tobacco again. It'll grow other things because the tobacco uses some nutrients and other plants use different nutrients. So the tobacco saps the land of the nutrients it needs, but leaves the others, of course. And so they could use it for other things, just not tobacco. So you had to have more and more and more land. You also had to have a lot of labor because these big old caterpillars that are just huge can eat through a leaf a day. And so basically these enslaved people had to go and they basically had to touch every leaf on every plant for acres and acres and acres at least once a week to make sure that the caterpillars were off of these leaves and not eating the tobacco. Then you had fluctuating prices for the tobacco, which meant that if the prices were up in London, then that was great. If they were not, then that was really bad. And the tobacco, they had what were called hogsheads, and that's the barrel, and it's HOGS like hogs, head HEAD, and those were the barrels that the dried tobacco was stored in and shipped in. And so it took a lot of tobacco once it's dried up. It takes a lot of tobacco to fill up one of those hogsheads. So these guys the plantation owners had to produce more and more and more tobacco in order to make money. So it was almost a losing proposition after a while. Mercantilism is the economic theory that the British were adhering to for the 200 years or so. And the idea was that you had overseas colonists and you would exploit the natural resources there. You would use the land and then the labor of the enslaved people for the benefit of the mother country. You also had indentured servants, which that's another story. But the idea of mercantilism is that you have these colonies and they exist solely for the benefit of the mother country. And you want to keep everything at home. You want to keep all your wealth within your country. So you don't want to be spending your money on imports from other places because then you're lining their pockets. You really just want to line your own pockets and keep all your wealth for yourself. It worked to a degree, but long term it didn't. So long story, but I think we talked about that earlier. But so you have these first Europeans in slavery were actually in Russia and in the Balkans. So you had the Russians had experience with the sugar cultivation, but it was cheaper to import these Africans. And so this forced migration began as early as 1440, which is, I mean, 52 years before Columbus just even discovered, quote unquote, happened to land in the Caribbean. So in 1500, the demand for sugar increased. People have a sweet tooth in England, of course, and so production needed to be increased. The price dropped, and so more people could afford it, which then led to a higher demand for more sugar, and that required more enslaved people. So the slave trading was more and more lucrative, meaning it was more and more profitable, after these Turks closed the European access to Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, in 1453. And so the Europeans' access to the Silk Road products from the Orient and from the Middle East dried up, and it became much more expensive. So the Europeans always needed to trade across the into Asia. They wanted pepper for meat preservation. They wanted silk from the silkworms that were on the mulberry trees in a very, very remote part of far eastern China. And so they were relying on Constantinople for these Russian and these Balkan slaves before the African trade set up. So after that, after all of this went down with Constantinople, the Europeans had to start looking for something else. And I'm going to stop that video here, and we'll pick up in just a second with the next part.